Okay, so let's get started. This is CALLERLAB. We're in Las Vegas. Today is April 18th, and I believe I'm moderating this panel. My name is Clark Baker. I'm from Belmont, Massachusetts, and the other voice you hear is Don Beck, and he's from Chilmark, Massachusetts. The title of this talk is Call Evolution. And I don't believe this is one of the talks that's ever been given before. We're relying on my knowledge and Don's knowledge and some research we did. And you guys might know some stuff. And, you know, please jump in and contribute. I have some handouts. I have more handouts than there are people in the room, so everyone gets a handout. Did you want to start just briefly? You were going to say something before I start reading.
Yeah. I was going to just a couple of quick words, but I haven't figured out what they are yet. So while I'm thinking of those, I wanted to mention to Clark, because I've forgotten, say happy birthday to your daughter for me today. He's really devoted to being here instead of at home. As Mike Seastrom said in his keynote address this morning, and I'm wildly misquoting him, in the good old days in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, when we had lots of new calls, and I don't think he was heading in the same direction that we are with them. But what we're planning to talk about is some of the behind-the-scenes stuff that happened when this rash of calls came. Just anecdotes that we happen to know personally or have heard about. One we were going to tell has to do with Frank Lane, who's sitting here. Just the snaparoo star-through story. No, but you're compromised with it in the use of generalization, but we'll get to that. But before we get into that, Clark's done a lot of research on the exact dates and history of how many calls invented when and why and that kind of stuff. And in order to say it properly to you guys, he wrote it out. And so you guys can, if you want, tune out. He's got the same stuff on a handout. But don't. It's much more interesting when Clark talks about it.
A square dance call, as used in this talk, will be a word or a phrase that's associated with a dance action. It has one or more starting positions and associated dance action. In the old days, we called these basics. Fortunately for us, Bill Burleson, a dancer from Minerva, Ohio, started keeping track of all the square dance calls that were invented and published an encyclopedia that he updated 3 times a year. Bill took the unique approach of giving each call a number, which became known as its Burleson number, starting with number 1, which was a set or a square, number 2, do-si-do, etc. My oldest copy of this encyclopedia is dated 1970, and it appears to describe 919 calls before its owner started adding updates. The August 1971 update contains the calls 1,159, which was Alter the Yo-Yo, to 1,226, which is called Partner, Half Tag, and Spin. The August 1972 update, that's a year later, contains calls 1446, Single Scoot and Trade, through 1491, Spin Chain the Zoom. I know how to do 2 of those. The calls that were in use in club dancing in the late 1960s is described by the booklets published by Bob Osgood's Sets in Order organization. The first booklet was called The Basic Program of American Square Dancing and described 50 calls. The next booklet was called The Extended Basics Program of American Square Dancing and described an additional 25 calls. These, in shorthand, we called these the Basic 50 and the Extended 75. At this point, you should have 2 questions. Why does Burleson document about 1,000 calls in 1970 when Bob Osgood says we're only dancing 75 of them? And how come I've never heard of the calls you mentioned, like Spin Chain the Zoom? Burleson documented every call he could find. And actually, let me take just get a mental picture here. If we think of square dancing in the old days, I'm going to think of it as like 1950 over here. And then we move along, and traditional and club square dancing kind of splits up and goes its separate ways. 1960 is going to be boom times, lots of clubs forming, lots of calls. We're up to 1970, A lot more calls being invented. Those are the numbers I just talked about, over 1,000, and yet we're trying to standardize and have in the 60 to 70 range, the Bob Osgood books. Then we're up to 80, 1980, 1990, 2000, all the way up to 2010. I'm going to keep mentioning dates in that range, and you want to kind of think about where we are in that. So Burleson documented every call he could find. However, he did not tell us either the author or when it was written. In 1976, J. King published the Handbook of Modern Square Dancing, which incorporated everything he had been able to learn about the various calls over his 15 years of thinking and study. So that's J. King. He's got from like 1960 to 1975 that he's been watching the activity and gathering data. And he was the kind of guy who wanted to put it in groups and sort and collate. He just didn't say, as they come in, I'll give them a number and publish it. So J. King organized the calls into various groups and told us the author, the year written, when it was known, and also the city and state the author was from. Occasionally, he gave a little bit of history. While his handbook was to be updated regularly, I only received a few updates, perhaps no more than 2, before Jay's untimely death. Using his book and other research, I can tell you some quick facts. The oldest calls for which I have a date and author are Alaman Thar, which we still use today, Double Bow Knot, Harlem Rosette, and Grand Harlem Rosette. Those all were accredited to Lloyd Shaw in 1938. Now, Frank Lane's sitting in the audience. Do you know if Lloyd really wrote those calls, or did he just research them? Yeah, you certainly danced them, yeah. And you started dancing in? 1939. Great. So you're just going to raise your hand every time I make a mistake, okay? Just so I have you in the corner of my eye. Good. There are 10 or fewer calls listed every year from 1938, which would be off the door, all the way up to 1960. So year by year, less than 10 calls coming out. Just for the people on the tape, I kind of stood up and painted a timeline, what I'm thinking on the audience's left from about 1950 to the audience's far right up to about 2010. Yeah. From 1960 up to 1975, there's a linear increase in new calls each year, starting at about 10 per year to 200 per year. This peaks in 1976, where 332 new calls came out, and it continued to stay in the 200s for the next 6 years. From 1983 to 1994, we have a linear decline to about only 36 new calls per year, and that's as far as I have accurate records. We do know that the 2003 issue of Burleson lists 5,125 calls, and that the rate of new call creation has dropped drastically since then, perhaps to fewer than 10 per year. And on your handout, you will have a graph of how many calls were invented each year from the 1930s up to 1994. And I don't think this data has ever been seen before, because it took data I had, and I worked with Debbie Cedar on some stuff. And basically we get this information from J. King's dictionary for the early years, note services, which Debbie has and which I have, and then some other note services that only Debbie had. And I think this is good stuff. So now you get a sense of all the calls. Some of you may not have lived through that. I started dancing full-time in '74, so I kind of hit the beginning of the peak and saw all that happen. Now, Don and I are not dance historians, and we can't really speak to the history of the really old calls, like where did Ladies' Chain come from, and what about do-si-do, and why do we cross our arms. We only have a little information on certain calls from even the 60s. Jim Mayo, in his book Step by Step Through Modern Square Dance History, which I encourage all of you to get a copy of, I certainly own one, tells how the choreography changed from that of dance routines in the 50s to all the calls that we had in the 60s. As each new call came out, for example, Dixie Chain, And when I mention calls, when I know the author and year written, I just want to mention them so you get kind of some names in your head and just when they happened. Dixie Chain was a guy named Bill Owen in 1952. Square Through, these are new calls that were coming out in the late 50s, early 60s, was Bill Henson in 1957. And Wheel and Deal, Clarence Watson in 1960. Each of those calls, as they came out, took time to become integrated into the dance routine and cause a further migration toward our current style of choreography, this extemporaneous, ever-changing routine. While the rest of this talk will focus on what Don and I know and cover the period more from 1970 forward, I want to leave you with two stories that I found from an earlier time. In 1958, Ed Gautt, G-A-U-T, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, wrote a call called Shuffle the Deck. And after all, the theme of our conventions, that's entertainment, and here we are in Vegas. That started a series of calls named after gambling terms. And we'll see later that naming a call is both a very important thing and also not so easy to do. Other calls with these gambling names include Shake the Dice, 1960, Wheel and Deal by Clarence Watson in 1960, Spin the Wheel, also Clarence Watson in 62, Acey Deucey, Larry D in 63, Fold, I don't know if that was a gambling term or just a thing. I had never thought of it that way, but it certainly fits the gambling theme. Dick Kenyon in 63, Joker's Wild, Glenn Hinton in 63, Shoot the Moon, and Cut the Deck. Jay King, in his book, offers this insight on the call circulate. The term circulate was coined by Chuck Riley, R-A-L-E-Y, of Lakewood, California in late 63. The idea of a circulate was presented in its first useful form by Larry D. of Rosemont, Pennsylvania, in early 1963 with his call Acey Deucey, which is still in use today, although it can be called directionally, using today's terminology as simply end, circulate, and centers trade, and that works correctly from parallel waves or two-face lines. And Jay goes on to say, I still remember the impact that Acey Deucey had on us when this idea of moving across the set from one wave to another was first workshopped by Les Goucher. Later in 1963, Glenn Hinton of Stockville, Nebraska, conceived the notion of both the ends and the centers circulating, and he called the move Joker's Wild. The term that has stood the test of time best, however, is Chuck Riley's circulate. It is descriptive and directional, and it has spawned many offshoots of its own. Bob Osgood offers this information on how Do Paso got its name. And someone else called me on this, so I just said, look, it's written in a book right here. I'm just reading what it says. So, in Texas, years ago, this was known as Do-Si-Do. Only the movement would go on continuously with a partner left, corner right, etc. for as long as the caller wished. Certainly long enough for him to recite some of his favorite rhyming pattern. In the 1940s, Dr. Lloyd Shaw, who had been using a different northern-style do-si-do, saw this version while attending a square dance in El Paso, Texas. Impressed by it and feeling that it had an equal place in the activity, he dubbed it the Do Paso to honor his host city. The name has remained ever since. So those are kind of all I know about really old stuff. And some of the traditional coloring lists that I'm on, they have discussions. They're mainly into contra dancer and English country dancing, and they go back to really old stuff, and sometimes they use the same moves we do, like the ladies' chain. They can probably give us a whole history of how that was used in French quadrilles or whatever. Before we get on to the evolution of specific calls, and I want to have the bulk of this be stories that we know about certain calls and show you where recycle and an ocean wave came from and stuff. I wanted to mention the role of caller note services. These note services started in the late 1940s as a round robin where, for example, 12 leaders each wrote up a page of ideas, favorite calls, and interesting material and sent it to the next person in the circle. When you received it, you had 12 pages of material. You had 2 weeks to read it, absorb the ideas, replace your sheet, add your new sheet, send it on, and it just kept going around and around. Back then, the dances were set pieces with a name, a defined pattern, and callers wrote their favorite ones in black books. Some of the museums now, the Square Dance Foundation New England, has a couple of callers' black books from the 40s and 50s. By the 1960s, choreography had started to change, and there was a focus on the individual calls. Les Gouchard and Willard Orlick offered note services in the 1960s that were a popular way to find out about these new calls and how to use them. They were joined by Jay King, who started a note service in 67, Jack Lazary in 71, Bill Peters started one in 72, Al Brundage, Earl Johnson, and Deuce Williams started one in 75, and Bill Davis started one in 1982. And there were some others. Most of those don't exist anymore today. I think there might be one that still is published in Europe. Each note service publisher would pick a few calls from all that crossed his desk and feature them. These calls would come with teaching hints, some sample choreography. In addition to featuring some calls, a few note services published all the calls that came across their desk, including the author's name and location. This is how we know who wrote most of the calls. However, some call authors did not write up their call. Instead, they would just call it at a dance, and it got spread by word of mouth. A note service publisher would find out about it, write it up, but he wouldn't know the author. Ironically, sometimes it was the most popular calls that were going to catch on that were written and circulated this way, and sometimes even errors were introduced. And that's why we don't know the authors of some of the biggie calls sometimes, even the ones invented in the 70s or 80s. We know that many calls were invented in the 1970s. They were propagated by local callers subscribing to the note services and trying to what they found out on their dancers. So they'd get the note service, they'd go to the dance, they'd try out this call, that call, and then sometimes those dancers would talk to other callers and so forth. And then the traveling callers would come through, and they'd come to town and dazzle the dancers with the latest and greatest calls. And then those dancers would bring the calls back to their local caller, ask him to reteach it and use it and explain it. Sometimes groups were formed whose primary focus was to dance all the new experimental calls. That seems preposterous today, given, you go to clubs and what people are interested in. You go, can I show you something new? And they're like, no. So, in Massachusetts in 1967, Jay King ran a new calls workshop, and perhaps he was using it to screen calls for his newsletter. Bob Gamble, caller down in Florida now, ran a workshop in 1975 that I attended a few times, and it was themed around learning and dancing these new calls. Don Beck had a group called Don's Pawns, and it met monthly and allowed Don to test his new ideas. And he used it for other things too, but that was a testing ground. Jim Mayo explained how choreography changed in the 1960s, and we've documented that new calls were being created upwards of 200 a year at the peak. What we haven't discussed is why did that happen? Why were these calls created? What was in it for the author who created a new call, the local and traveling caller who taught it and used it, or the dancers who learned it and danced it? Certainly something, because it grew like gangbusters in the 70s. So Don and I brainstormed what are some reasons to write or teach a new call. And I don't know that these are the right reasons or these are really what happened, but one is it gets your name in print. Just like when you publish a singing call record and people hear you and do it, you're like, ooh, you did that, Amarillo by Morning, that's a really good singing call record. Ooh, he did Ping Pong Circulate, that's a call I use every week. It's fun. It was fun creating calls, teaching them, seeing the dancers do it. Sometimes we needed to get into or out of a new formation. When diamonds were first invented, or hourglasses, or galaxies, suddenly, switch to a diamond, flip the diamond. There are all sorts of ways to get in and out. Even quarter tag was kind of an unusual formation. It also can give us a new kinesthetic dance feel or motion. Sometimes you just want workshop material. You're calling a dance, you're hired on a Saturday night. You need to do something. You called the first tip, the second tip, the third tip. They're warmed up. They're dancing. Like, why not teach them a new call? It equalizes the floor, and then they're all listening to you, and they think it's pretty cool, and then you kind of move on. You maybe do it again later that night, and then you're done with it. It's an outlet for a caller's creative juices. The dancers already are in a learning mode. We've just taught them for 30 weeks, and then we dance them and stuff, and they want to learn more. And maybe we didn't have plus and advanced back then, or you didn't want to have them moving on in that way. You can just have them learn more by teaching them this call and then move on to another call. Maybe the caller or the dancer is bored with the same old stuff. And a caller like Lee Kottman, he basically needed new material for these challenge groups. There were a lot of advanced and challenge dancing groups, and there was a challenge caller in about 5 or 6 different areas, and they were always looking for material. And Lee would write a call, and then it would go on audio tapes, and they'd get mailed around the country, and all the other callers would hear it and use it, and that was a way that calls got created and spread. So one question you might have is, why do we need more calls anyway? Why not just use directional calling? And AC-DC, which is on the Plus program, is a good example of that. We know that AC-DC can be called, as I mentioned already, it's centers, trade, and circulate. However, it's not generally called directionally at mainstream dances. I really don't think, if we listen to tapes of mainstream dances, that very many AC-DCs are called directionally, even though it sounds and feels good. I'll give you another one. At our local Plus club, if the caller ever has the centers cross run and then the centers trade, our dancers automatically respond meow, because that's the call mix, which is on the A2 list, and that the sound effect comes from the meow mix, cat food or whatever. So we as dancers are always watching for when the caller calls centers cross run and then centers trade. And sometimes if he calls centers cross run and then AC-DC, since that had that centers trade, we might be funny and even go meow there or something. But so we don't have mix at Plus, and yet he directionally calls a mix every occasionally. So those things do happen, but generally, just because you can do it directionally doesn't mean it gets done. If the action doesn't have a name, the dance action generally doesn't get used. At Plus, AC-DC is sometimes called directionally and sometimes called by name. And at Advanced, AC-DC is generally called by name. And one of the advantages of giving a name to an action is we can have variations. So the variations on AC-DC, sometimes we can call AC-DC 1.5. Or we can call 6x2 AC-DC. Or AC-DC from a diamond formation. And in all those other variations, it wouldn't make much sense to say, and circulate centers trade and all go 1.5. I mean, then you've got too much of a mouthful of words. So that's why it's worth giving a name to a dance action. I want to point out that mainstream has a bunch of pairs of calls that differ in the use of hands. So this is a way of saying that even though we may have an action that we could call directionally, and why give it a name, sometimes we have an action, we've given it 2 names or close to 2 names. So we have so many pairs where you use hands on one and not on the other. I'm talking about California twirl versus partner trade, star through versus slide through, dive through versus pass the center. And after many years, we still retain both on the mainstream program. We have had a few pairs of calls that have gone away. Usually a newcomer comes along and bumps the old one out. For example, in 1974, we were dancing Couples Hinge and Trade, which was written by Ron Schneider in '69. So if you haven't danced that call from 2 face lines, you do a couples hinge, the center couples trade, and all the couples kind of turn a quarter, and you end in a beginning double pass through. So soon a new call with the same effect and a better dance action was created, and Ferris Wheel by Don in 1974 bumped out the couples hinge and trade. And it died a pretty quick death, as I remember. It only took it about a year to go away. Because I started dancing mostly in '74, and I remember that coming out, and I remember the other one, we learned it, and it was gone. We used to have Substitute by Clarence Watson that was written in '61, and Zoom came along by Gus Green in 1972. And we added both to the mainstream list in '78, and then we dropped Substitute in '84 because we felt we didn't need them both. The final example is Curly Q, another one by Clarence Watson in '61, and then Touch a Quarter by Deuce Williams came out in 1976. And Curly Q was on our initial 1975 mainstream list. And then Touch and all of its fractions, Touch, Touch a Quarter, a half, 3/4, we added to the list in 1980. But in 1984, we dropped all the fractions except Touch a Quarter. And in 1988, we dropped Curly Q, leaving only Touch a Quarter. And as long as I'm on Curly Q, I had one other story. Dave Taylor's wife, he's one of our former chairman of the boards. Angie had her arm injured on a curlicue. Is that right? True story? Good. And at the next CALLERLAB convention, he was chairman of the board, and we had the membership vote, and we dropped curlicue from mainstream. So there's an anecdote for you. Ron Schneider once said, "Who needs pass and roll? I could just step to a wave, scoot back, and split circulate." And Lee Kottman, who was there, responded, "I do." So some people need these calls, other people maybe don't. As long as we're on Lee, and I'm almost done here, and we'll go into some more interactive discussion. Lee was a master at creating calls, and we awarded him a milestone for that contribution to square dancing. While he may mostly be known as a challenge caller, and while many of his calls are in current use at challenge, you probably use each of these calls at every mainstream dance that you call. Scoot back, these are all his, 1969. Recycle, 1975. And at plus, roll, 1971. Cut the diamond, 1973. Coordinate, 1974. And chase right in 1975. Earlier, we mentioned how the new calls get spread around. In the challenge activity in the 1970s, there were less than 10 challenge callers. So most dancers purchased reel-to-reel audio tapes of the few dances that were called. This would mean that a challenge caller like Lee would introduce a new call, it would be recorded, that tape would be mailed to 30 or more basement tape groups, and this caused the call to be learned and danced by most challenge dancers and their corresponding local challenge caller. And then later the note services would pick it up. At this point, I want to stop, and we have a whole list of things we could talk about. I'm going to turn it over to Don and let him talk for a bit and pick one or two or three and tell some stories, and I am going to hand out the handouts while you're doing that.
Okay. Clark, you're only going to stick to the ones we have here? Or something?
Whatever you want.
That's fun. One of the things that while you were talking about Wheel and Deal and when it was introduced, Clark, it reminded me that when new calls were introduced and when people were creating these for whatever ego trip they had or whatever the reason was, they needed material, it was always interesting to see which ones would succeed and which ones wouldn't, which would become popular and which wouldn't. And at the time, I sort of related it to modern music. Some music rose on the charts and were hits, and the others, didn't quite make it. And I think with modern music, that still holds. But an anecdote that I remember, and I'm bringing up because maybe Frank can help clarify whether I'm right or not, but Wheel and Deal, as far as I know, became popular after it was created because Johnny Davis used it in a singing call figure, which I think was Big Daddy, but I'm not sure. And from what I heard, because it was a really good singing call, good music, good caller calling it, that people started learning how to do a Wheel and Deal. Heads lead right, circle the line, pass through, Wheel and Deal, double pass through. First couple go left, next couple go right, and zero line get out. And from what I understand, that's what made that particular call popular because it got used a lot in the singing call. What do you remember, Frank? Hold on a second.
This is being taped. This is Frank Lane.
Clarence Watson actually danced with me every other week in Kansas City. And every time he would come to the dance, he would bring me a sheet of probably 8 or 10 pages of new basics he had written in the last 2 weeks. Now, Clarence had, as naturally you can see, a very prolific mind as far as creating new basic choreography. But Clarence Watson had no degree of deciding which was good and which was not. I mean, he handed me Wheel and Deal one night amongst a bunch of stuff, that the other stuff was not worth a darn. I said, Wheel and Deal is a gem. Same thing with curlicue, because I still like curlicue. The day they took it away, I was having lunch, and I was sitting there with some young callers. I can't even remember who it was, and their wives were saying they were glad I got rid of it because it was hard to teach. And I said, well, if we're going to get rid of curlicue, we've got to get rid of star through and box the net also. And they said, well, oh, no, we use those. And I said, what do you think a curlicue is? The man does a star through, the girl does the box the net, and a quarter more. I mean, if they're awkward, we ought to get rid of all of them. But anyway, back to the Clarence Watson thing. That was the story on this thing. Like I say, he had a tremendous mind. And every week or two, he would bring me a sheath of papers with basics, and maybe 4 or 5 each time. And 4 of them were bad. The 5th one was a gem.
Thanks, Frank. I guess the first call I want to talk about, because I happen to know personally about it, and I've told a few people over the years, and they seemed, oh, that's interesting, and so hopefully it'll interest you, is the first call that I wrote was Ferris wheel. I was of the opinion at the time that we didn't need new calls. There was plenty of variety to do with the calls we had. Why are people doing this all the time? I lived in New England. I was out in the Chicago area on business, driving about an hour commute to where I was working from where I was staying, and my mind was going on more than just driving, and I was saying, we don't need new calls, but if I were to write a new call, what would it be? And all of a sudden, and Clark was talking about sometimes it had something to do with popular formation at the time. Two-face lines were just coming into use more and more during that period. And so I pictured that and pictured this smooth flowing motion of a Ferris wheel, of what the call Ferris wheel is now. And, and the wheels started going, I said, maybe I should tell people about this, and I gave it a name. That name was not Ferris wheel. It was Shuffle and Deal, because it was like a wheel and deal, but I pictured one side of the square shuffling like cards into the other side of the square. And when I got home, I looked at Burleson, and I saw that shuffle was used about 6 or 7 times already. And not being a challenge dancer, I didn't know that one of those was being used and the others weren't. I said, 6 uses of the word shuffle versus 7, what's the difference? Let's call that, because it's an obvious name for this. I told a challenge dancer friend of mine shortly thereafter, and he said, yeah, but where's the shuffle? And I started to get a clue about this. And eventually, as what I did, because I wasn't a traveling caller to spread calls around, I wrote them up and sent them to the people that were writing note services that I was subscribed to. And I got a call from Bill Peters. I had never met the man. I was getting his note service and was impressed with him. And he said, Don, this is Bill Peters out in California, and that new call you just sent me, Shuffle and Deal, I've noticed nobody's published it yet, and I really like the movement and everything, but I said, but you don't like the name. He said, yeah, where's the shuffle? And I said, yeah, I guess I have been told that I should have not used shuffle because there is one of those 6 or 7 that is actually used and still in challenge. He said, well, nobody else has published it. Would you be open to changing the name? And you're the author. If you want to keep that, that's fine. But if you'd be willing, I said, I'd be willing to change it. How long a time do you give me to figure it out? He said, well, are you open to suggestions? Because I've got a thought for a name. And I said, I'm open to suggestions. And he said, how about Step Ahead? And I said, no, Bill, that's not going to sell. And again, the ingredients that make a call rise to the top of the list is, 1 is the movement is good, 2 is it's to and from formations that are commonly used, 3 is that the name is appropriate, and we can talk later about what's appropriate and what's not, but catchy is one of the things, and 4 is that it hasn't been done before, and there's a whole bunch of things. But so anyway, I said, Bill, how long do I have? And he said, well, I'm publishing in about 3 or 4 days, I think. And so I I went up and called Jay King. I was fortunate enough to know Jay personally because he worked at the same place I did. And I said, you know the new call I sent you? He said, well, I really haven't read my mail for the last week yet. I said, well, thanks anyway. So he wasn't going to help me with a good name. So I started thinking about it, and I thought, well, it starts like a couple circulate. But with a wheel and deal, I'm going to call it Circus Wheel. And I said, no, that's not catchy enough. So I changed it from Circus Wheel to Ferris Wheel. And the rest is history. And it caught on. And the worst part about it is I used to be of the opinion that we don't need all these new calls. But, boy, that went to my head, and I just started going from there. The next one I wrote was Triple Cast, which I understand is still used at C3 or C4. I have no idea how it works.
If I could get, I'm going to take myself and 3 other dancers. We need a line of 4. Since Don talked about shuffle the deck, let's make a line of 4. I don't care about genders. We're all going to be looking this way. I wanted to show you a few calls, so got to have some dancing here. Good. So here we have 4 of us. We're facing the audience. We're in a line of 4. If we did the call shuffle the deck, the couple on the right is going to move sideways to the left a little bit. The couple on the left goes to we're lined up, and we're now 2 couples facing the same direction. And this is a whole family of calls. Let's go back for a sec. So here we are. If we do a double shuffle, you guys are going to keep going to the far side. Double shuffle, and we'd call that an as couples reverse sachet. No, that's an as couples half sachet today, but they didn't have that word. If we did a shuffle and wheel, then one couple's going to do like the shuffle, the other couple's going to wheel, and I don't remember if I get it right, but we'll have me wheel and you guys shuffle. So we wheel, they shuffle, and that does that. And then let's go back. And here we have our normal line of 4. And then we have wheel and deal, which we all know and love. Let's do a wheel and deal. And we're going to undo that. The one motion we haven't really done is the one where we kind of go individually in that wheel and deal type action. And I have a story on that, and I've lost the name of the guy who did it. I was just trying to look, and I couldn't find in my records. I want to go for Colin. Is it Colin Walton? I think he noticed his dancers, they kept coming out half sachet, and he'd call, and they'd be half sachet, and he'd look again, and he watched real carefully what they did. And when he was calling wheel and deal, some of them were doing what we now call a turn and deal. So he gave it that name, turn and deal, and he's always very proud of that. So do you guys know turn and deal? You're just going to go individually that way, 180. Turn and deal. And we go like this. Yeah. Okay, so it's like wheel and deal, but now we're on each other's side. So between shuffle the deck, double shuffle, single double shuffle, and so forth, turn and deal, wheel and deal, in all the different combinations, they all kind of got calls, or they got names. Frank's going to say something.
Actually, I've been operating under a little bit of a misapprehension because I was calling in San Diego, and I picked up Shuffle the Deck when it was brand new. It had never been published in a note service. Now, I was under the impression that Bob Doherty wrote it, and you quoted another author, and I don't know. 2 weeks later, I took it to the National Convention in Denver and introduced it. At that time, Les Gocher and I had a falling out, and we were not talking. But he was in watching my workshop, and evidently he liked what he saw and was going to print it in his magazine. So he did. But as you say, I think now the right-hand couple shuffles in front. Is that right?
On shuffle the deck, the right-hand couple goes in front.
Yeah. When Bob Doherty wrote it, the left-hand couple shuffled in front. That was the original way the figure was written. Les published it with the right-hand couple shuffling in deck. I called him on it. He called Bob Doherty and said, I put it in a national magazine, and you're going to become famous for being the author. Could we do it my way? And Bob Doherty went along with it, and the right-hand couple shovels in front. But the figure was originally written with the left-hand couple sliding in front, which makes no difference. I mean, but that's an interesting story.
Okay, back to Don for another story.
One last comment on Ferris wheel. I thought about it later, but the names of calls almost always are verbs. They're an action. And Ferris wheel is a noun. There are a few others like that I thought of recently, but it's just interesting. And my philosophy when I was naming calls was, if I can give it an obvious name, either the action is obvious or it's really closely related to something else and an extension of it, use that, because the dancers know that already. If you can't come up with something that relates to that, don't mislead them by trying. Go way off base and come up with something totally different. And that seemed to work with a lot of the ones that have risen to the top. Clark, what do you suggest? Is it your turn to tell a story, or you want me to pick another call?
I want to do recycle just because I know it pretty well, and I thought it has an interesting story on it. And I do want to show it so you get a chance to dance it. We're going to need 8 dancers here if we could. I'm happy to be one of them. Yep. And I don't know if we care about genders, so I don't care about genders. But I have a normal couple, and I'm happy. And here comes one more. So this is a Lee Cotman call. We're going to have us be heads. We're going to have the heads pass the ocean. And he initially conceived of the call as being done from a quarter tag like we have here, and it being an 8-dancer call. And the people talk to the people in the center wave. We're going to do our normal recycle. In this case, the girl's going to fold, follow the guy around, and face in. But this time, there'll really be a reason to be doing that action, because we're going to end up out on the outside where that couple is. So you're going to fold, follow me around for a bit, and then we'll face in. You're going to fold, follow Chris around, and face in. Is that okay? So let's have the center wave do a recycle out around the others, and they just walk forward. So that's what we're doing, all the way around. Yep, yeah. Now, those people who are coming in, the person on the left is going to walk forward and turn around, turning to your right, and the other one's going to individually veer way out. Okay? And that's called all 8 recycle. And what the couple coming in did, we now call facing couple recycle. And what the people who are in the wave did, we call an ocean wave recycle. The name, we don't say facing couple or ocean wave. So, look, can we do that 1 or 2 more times? Okay, you guys are doing the easy thing, the recycle we're used to. Chris, we're going to walk in, turn around. You're going to veer out to the left. Let's do an all 8 recycle. We walk in, turn around. The girl goes out, and you kind of keep hang on to her. And it moves the genders around a bit, so it's it can be confusing if we just keep doing them. Can we do another one? Recycle. We're going out wide. Yep. And let's do one more. Recycle. This time our girls are going in, turning around, and I'm going over. And if we got good at it, and we did it 4 times, and we're back to a 0. Okay, that's good for our square. You can sit down. And the people ended up liking that ocean wave motion and gave that a name, just called it recycle rather than all 8 recycle. And we started doing that, and that one's on our mainstream list. And then the facing couple one we have on A1 or A2. And if you'll bear with me, I need 3 more people. Sorry to make you pop up and down. There's a few more recycles. Yep. Let's have facing couples. Facing couples is good. Often with these calls, people start inventing variations. You noticed it even with Harlem Rosette. There's Grand Harlem Rosette. So it started back in 39 of let's extend these things. We know how to do the facing couple recycle. If we do a cross cycle, there's a lot of times we add a cross version to a call. Then you're going to do the normal thing you do. We're going to walk forward and trade. Bill, you're going to veer over. And we went from a facing couple to a 2-face line. And then there must be the other corresponding version of cross cycle from the 2-face line. In this case, the ends are still just going to cross fold as usual, but the centers are going to cross fold, follow them around, and face in. So you get to go first. Cross cycle. Keep turning, keep turning. Yes, you had to go a full 360. Let's do that 2 more times. This time you guys go in and trade. Cross cycle from facing couples, and we have you veer way over. And now, no, you don't turn. Good. And we have the 2-face line. And now if we do another cross cycle from here, the centers are going to cross fold, follow the ends around like on recycle. It has a very different feel. Okay, let's veer left. Centers hinge. What do we have? There must be a diamond recycle. The diamond recycle takes the cross cycle type action the points, Bob and I, are going to cross-fold while the centers finish their fold, follow me around, and face in. Diamond recycle. So we go around, and we have facing couples. And then there's got to be the corresponding other version, and on this, the person on the right is just going to veer out to the left to become a point of a diamond. The person on the left, the bows, are going to walk forward and hinge. We'll underachieve a little bit. Ready? Diamond recycle. So we go in, we got a diamond. Now, every one of those calls, we could do the all 8 version. If we had a quarter line, like a two-face line across the middle, we could do all 8 cross-cycle. If we had a diamond in the center, we could do all 8 diamond recycle. They diamond recycle out, they diamond recycle in. So that spawned a whole family, and each one has pairs of calls like that. Thank you. So there's a bit of call evolution on that.
Just a piece of history that I remember on that. The diamond recycle from a diamond to facing couples was written by Ed Friedenberg in Michigan. I saw that and said, well, where's the facing couple version? So I saw that you could do the second half to match it as part of the pair, but before publishing it, I called Ed, and I said, do you mind if I latch onto your call and complete the operation so we had both parts, facing couple and starting in diamond? He said, no, go for it. So that got created as a result of that to finish the pair out. Is that used anywhere, Clark?
Not much.
That's what I thought, yeah. I'm just looking at the list of things that Clark wanted us to talk about. Again, it was fun to guess whether a call was going to be popular or not and what have you. And I went to a dance in Massachusetts once that Jerry Helt had come in from Ohio to call. And he introduced a new call that he'd written. Now, Jerry's more of a basic kind of person and not one that you think of as creating lots of calls, but back in those days, it was fair game for everybody. And he introduced sweep a quarter at this dance, which is basically circle a quarter to the left or right, depending on the body flow of the previous call. I thought it was the dumbest call going. Boy, was I wrong. You know, I love that call. It's one of the first concepts that is introduced. It's introduced in mainstream. Anything and roll is a concept introduced at plus, and then you get into as couples and the concepts in A1, and it keeps going in challenge. That's the only concept I can think of at mainstream, and it's great because it makes you think. Its definition is dependent on the previous call. So as much as I thought about creating new calls at that time, I had no idea that was so nice. It was so simple and yet a beautiful call and does great stuff.
So has anyone ever heard of any calls or a caller named Claude Spears, Speres? Do you know Claude? Yeah, I'll look that up in a second, tell you the calls he wrote. I think I know. He wrote Hit the Wall, which is one that we use today in Challenge, from a trade buy setup, the ends partner tag, and the centers pass out. It's not a great call. And my understanding from my research is this is not a real person. This was some callers who were just having fun on the people who publish note services and the people who write calls. And they wrote kind of a slightly rude named person and wrote a couple of crappy calls and wrote them in. And lo and behold, they'll publish anything. And they thought that was pretty funny. And worse than that, one of them made it. And I believe it was Earl Johnson and maybe some Dave Haas who did that. So there they are, unmasked. Now, does anyone know George Spelvin, Spelvin? Anyone ever heard that name? Not a name I had heard, but if you search for it in Google and look in Wikipedia, it ends up that if you're in the theater business and you need to be listed on the playbill and you don't want to be listed under your true name, then you will be listed as George or Georgette Spelvin. And sometimes that's for the purpose of it's a mystery and you don't want to uncover the mystery just by letting the audience read the playbill, and maybe there's a real reason why you wouldn't want to be known or something. And we have a bunch of calls written by George Spelvin. And I'd heard a story about that, and I did some research, and I'm pretty sure this is right. I believe it was Bill Peters. And the reason for that is several-fold. One is if you're publishing a note service and yet you're also actively writing calls, it's a little unseemly for you to be featuring, how great this new call you wrote was, or maybe people wouldn't trust you on it or something. And Bill was very active in theater, so he would have known about the Bill Spelvin. Or George.
I believe it was Bill Peters also because Bill told me.
But when I did research, I had other people say other things, so it's hard to know where the truth lies. And George has 2 calls that we use today. I'm going to give this, let me put talked on while I look it up.
About George, about Bill, about see, is there a short one to talk about? Walk the plank. And file to a line. All by George Williams. Bill. Yeah. By Bill Peters. Bill Davis, also in California, ran a note service, and he wrote a lot of calls, but he just did it under his own name. So you can do it both ways. Let me rattle off a piece of choreography that, for example, I see Bill Ackerman sitting in the corner. Bill would know how to do this. Maybe. From the appropriate position, Bill, could you do it nicely and take your time? Yeah. And that went through an era when we chose to name calls after popular callers' patter. You're looking good. Do it. Do it nicely. And CALLERLAB eventually had to step in because it was so much fun for the callers and so annoying for the dancers that we outlawed doing that. We shall not create choreography or put any on our list that, where its names could be interpreted just as kind of patter. Why don't you tell a story? Maybe, I don't know. Actually, I want triple play, but what leads up to that. After I'd written a number of calls, and some of which were actually successful, some we still have, some were quarterly selections for a while, and that was good enough for my ego trip. My mind was and constantly thinking of new calls to create. And follow this in your head, guys. If you have the heads go forward and touch a quarter, and from there, if you have, the call swap around. If you have the men do their part of a swap around, and the women do their part of a walk and dodge, I was going to call it swap and dodge. Until I realized we already call it men run. One of the important parts of writing a call is making sure that it hasn't been created before. And if so, that would have been the right name for it if it hadn't been the other thing. I wanted to give some talks at CALLERLAB, but CALLERLAB didn't allow that, about how to write a new call, how to name it properly, and what have you. And I wanted it, and CALLERLAB's Board of Governors was concerned it was going to help propagate the many more new calls and all this other stuff, whereas in fact I was trying to curb that by telling people proper ways to make sure it hasn't been done before and how to think them through and don't bother if the flow is bad and all this other stuff. But I was dying to find out if I could teach creativity. So a friend of mine was interested in becoming creative, Mike Lotteroot, a caller from New England who no longer calls and is no longer in New England. Said, sure, I'll be your guinea pig. And I gave him a bunch of things to think about, do this, do that, what have you. And he came up with a movement that really looked like it was pretty decent. He couldn't come up with a name. I pegged a name for it called Triple Play. Again, I don't remember how it goes, but it is used to challenge, and I'm sure Clark could show it to you if you cared. So I found it was interesting that one could teach creativity, and that was, part of the mental set of what was going on in the games of that time. You want me to go on, Clark? Sure, one more. Bob mentioned ASO as one of the calls that are common terminology. Now, aso is, Americans use it, but it's a Japanese word, aso desu ka, which means is that so. Lee Kaufman wrote a call prior to a trip to Japan to honor the Japanese people. Who's going to say aso, and he introduced it, I think, at CALLERLAB just before he went or what have you. And I looked at it and I said, that's nothing but a single hinge and box counter rotator quarter. And I went back to my group, Don's Pawns, and they knew single hinge. Most of them knew up through A1, but not beyond. And so I taught them split counter rotator quarter, and then I used it with a single hinge before, and pretty much I was using for maybe 3 tips. Only used it in combination with single hinge split counter rotator quarter, just like lead right circle to a line is a call. And they were dancing that very smoothly. Then I dropped that, and the next tip I taught them aso. And then I used them interchangeably. And I learned something. They really danced it differently. Even though it was the exact same footsteps. And I called it with the timing that was so they could dance it as one movement. And with, only following single hinge for those 3 tips with split counter rotator quarter, they still danced it differently. Yeah, that's what I thought. That's what I thought, Frank. I'll be damned, It was a very interesting experiment.
You certainly can.
I think I'm accurate as far as the individual is concerned, but one of the more interesting events and new calls that has come about that I can remember, there was this fellow in Ohio, Willard Orlick, who put out one of the better-known note services, and he was not a caller. I think it was Del Kuhlman. I swear that it is. But Del Kuhlman was a caller up in Michigan, and he sent Willard a new basic called swing through. And the way he described it was it had to be in a 4-hand, right-hand ocean wave with the boys on the end and the girls in the center. And then he described it as the boy turns the girl half with the right hand and the boys turn half with the left hand. Willard wrote back to him and says, it's a good feeling move, but it'll last about 2 months, described that way. He says, can I change the definition to those who can swing with the right and those who can swing with the left, and do it from various right-hand waves, left-hand waves, Alamo rings? Dale would not agree to it. Dale says, no, I wrote it. Boys turn the girls by the right, boys turn half by the left. Willard held off publishing it for about, I think, 2 months while he was arguing with Dell. And Dell never did decide to change it. Willard finally, I was talking to him this time, he says, I would hate to do this, but I'm going to print it my way. And he did, and of course, as we know, swing through has lasted and become one of our very basic moves. Del Kuhlman went to his grave disagreeing with the definition of swing through.
Swing through was Del Kuhlman, 1962.
I'm glad it's Del Kuhlman because I thought it was.
No, yes, see, this is good. And I'd wanted to hear the story of swing through because, as you know, swing through is one of our unusual calls where it's half by the right, half by the left, rather than end in adjacent center.
But it wasn't when he wrote it.
Yeah.
I started calling in 63 and everyone not called.
Okay. We need to wrap up. I have just a little bit to read to finish it. Are you okay with me doing that?
Tell more stories next year.
Yeah, save some stories for next year. Our branch of square dancing that split off in the 1950s and evolved in the 1960s was a folk activity. It was growing by leaps and bounds, but without any central controls. Bob Osgood created lists and booklets in the late 1960s that documented the calls in popular use. When CALLERLAB started in '74, they created their own list that had already changed from Bob's booklets. A tentative mainstream list was adopted in 1975 and approved in 1976. In each of the next 5 years, changes were made that reflected how the activity was changing. The list was then frozen for 4 years. Then more changes in 1988, 89, and 90, and that was the end of new calls being added to our current mainstream list. At a pre-convention meeting in 1973, Jack Lazary was appointed to chair the committee preparing the topic of new movements to be presented at CALLERLAB's first convention. He wrote, "I propose the following, that CALLERLAB select a cross-section of callers who represent coast to coast, border to border to border, and interest levels within the total picture, a committee of callers who are active in the picture and are interested in participating on this committee. The committee will select on a quarterly basis 1 or 2 mainstream experimental ideas, and the CALLERLAB would then put a stamp of approval on 1 or 2 and no more ideas within a quarterly system. Thus was born the quarterly selection system that slowed the onslaught of new calls that dancers had to learn, that provided a testing ground for the new calls and a controlled way for the calls to be added to our lists. Quarterly selection programs were later created for mainstream, plus, and advanced dance programs. And in the 1990s, it became harder and harder to find suitable new calls for quarterly selections, and we began to recycle existing calls. Quarterly selections were disbanded in 2001. Of course, we can always reinstate them if we have the need. And that pretty much concludes the formal presentation. We have time for brief questions. I really appreciate Frank being here. You'll be on the panel next year. And is there any comments or stories or anything you know of? Or I doubt we can answer questions on specific things. Mr. Reed. Here we have Jerry Reed.
Thank you, Clark. Just an interesting story on Also. Probably in the 70s sometime, Lee Kottman was on the Phil Donahue show, and he told a story of how he had created Also, and he said that he went on this tour to Japan, and he was calling along and called Also, and all the dancers stopped and said, Also, Also. and then he would say, no, really Also.
Well, thank you all for attending. It was fun preparing for this and looking up the history, and I think it's great that we have so many call authors, dates, and all that. Write it on your critique sheets if you want to see it given again. And enjoy the rest of your convention.